Bulfinch's Mythology, Stories of Gods and Heroes by Thomas Bulfinch. So this version I have here is obviously not the original. This was published by Word Cloud Classics out of San Diego in 2015. It's a little bit confusing trying to figure out how this book was originally published. And I'm going off of Wikipedia because that's what everybody uses nowadays, right? This is... So there's this thing called Bulfinch's Mythology, which for close to a century, I guess, was the standard introduction to Greek and Roman mythology in the English-speaking world. It was published... It gets a little bit confusing, but published sometime around the 1860s or 1850s. And for about a century until it was superseded in 1940 something, I forget exactly, 1940s, by Mythology by Edith Hamilton. And I think, somebody correct me if I'm wrong, I think up until now, Edith Hamilton's mythology is still the dominant introduction to Greek and Roman mythology. Has Edith Hamilton's mythology been replaced by anything? Am I missing something? I think it's still Edith Hamilton, right? And nobody reads Bulfinch's mythology anymore, or almost nobody. I remember... I went through a phase when I was in 6th and 7th grade when I was really interested in Greek mythology. And my mother recommended Bulfinch's Mythology to me. I don't think she had ever read it, but she just said, oh, well, you might enjoy Bulfinch's Mythology. It's one of those names that everybody recognizes, even if nobody reads it anymore. And I never read it. My mother had a copy of Edith Hamilton's Mythology in the house, and I don't think I read it cover to cover. I definitely flipped through it. I read a lot of other young adult introductions to Greek mythology during those years. I did actually pick up the audiobook of Bulfinch's Mythology when I was in my early 20s. It was slightly before I started reviewing books on my blog. So I never actually gave it a full review on my blog, but I did listen to it several times over because I actually bought the audiobook. It was back in the days when you actually would buy cassettes. And if memory serves, it was unabridged selections. So it wasn't the unabridged version. It was called Unabridged Selection, so it had some selections which were unabridged. Now, like I said, it's a little bit hard trying to figure out what the publishing history of this book is, and the Wikipedia article as it's currently written is a bit confusing. Wikipedia says it was published posthumously. Posthumously, how do you pronounce that? It was published after the death of Thomas Bulfinch. He died in 1890. And yet, when you read this, it reads like something that is written for an audience. Thomas Bulfinch is addressing the reader and telling them why this book is going to be useful for them. So I'm thinking to myself, okay, well, he must have been publishing it during his lifetime, right? But then if you go to the, again on Wikipedia, so there's the entry for Thomas Bulfinch, and then there's the entry for Bulfinch's Mythology, and they're a little bit different. Yeah, entry for Thomas Bulfinch, I guess he published 3 volumes during his lifetime. First one is The Age of Fable, which I think is what this is. That's been retitled here, Stories of Gods and Heroes, but I think that's essentially, if you open it up to the inside of the book, it does say The Age of Fable or Stories of Gods and Heroes. The Age of Fable or Stories of Gods and Heroes by Thomas Bulfinch. So it looks like he published this in 1855, and then he published other stuff. He published something on Charlemagne, and he published something on King Arthur, and those were later published after his death as a series of Bulfinch's Mythology. So the series of Bulfinch's Mythology was published after his death, but the Age of Fable, I think, was published in 1855. Except, if you read this, it references the discovery of Troy by German scholar Henry, how do you pronounce this? Schillmann in 1890. You can see I've written in my copy here. I says, is that right? But this book was published before 1890. I think even, okay, so the Age of Fable was published in 1855. I think the collection Bulfinch's Mythology was published, according to Wikipedia, I think in 1870. Bulfinch died in 1867. So how is this referencing the 1890 discovery of Troy? But I've actually, after I finished this book, I was listening to the LibriVox version of this on YouTube. In the LibriVox version of this book, which is in the public domain, obviously, but they reference that they've updated the book after Thomas Bulfinch died, updated to include new poems that he hadn't commentated on. I'll get to talking about the poems in a little bit. So, yeah, the other thing that confuses me a little bit is there's an introduction, which I clearly remember from the audiobook, which I used to listen to 15 years ago, 20 years ago now. 20 years ago now. Where does time go? Which is not in this version, but which is on the Project Gutenberg version. Okay, there are different versions of this book floating around, I guess, is what I want to say. In the introduction, which is missing from this version, but which was on the audiobook that I listened to 20 years ago and is on the Project Gutenberg, Thomas Bulfinch lays out his intentions for writing this book. And he says, if only the things that can make you money are valuable, then this book is not valuable. But he says, if literature is valuable, then this book is valuable. And he goes on to say that this book is meant essentially as a primer on Greek mythology, Greek and Roman mythology, so that you can understand the allusions that pop up to Greek and Roman mythology in modern literature. Now, modern, of course, I guess means at the time he was writing, which was 1855 for the first volume. But it's saying, look, you want to understand literature, right? Well, you can't understand literature unless you understand Greek mythology, because there's so many allusions to literature there's so many allusions to mythology being made in literature all the time. But if you read this book, then you'll be able to understand all the allusions and you'll be able to enjoy literature much better. Now, it's a kind of introduction that puts you off a little bit, because it's saying, like, it seems to me to be overselling the utility of this book, and it has a very kind of extracting value type framework to it. Whereas, I think a lot of us here on BookTube, or a lot of people who enjoy reading books, don't want to frame our reading in that way. I don't know. Sorry, I'm thinking out loud here now that the camera's on. Maybe I do that more than I'd like to admit, to be honest, especially when I read the classics. I'm thinking about extracting value, becoming a more cultured person, improving my brain. But there's also a certain part of me which resists that framing, which doesn't want to think of, which wants to enjoy Greek mythology just on its own terms, rather than something I need to study to enjoy modern literature. But anyways, that's the framing with which Thomas Bulfinch sets this up. So again, he had to have published this during his lifetime, right? Because he's obviously addressing the reader and telling them why this is going to be useful to them. And then, having set that framing up, he will give a story from Greek mythology, and then he'll show how this story is useful for understanding modern literature. And again, modern meaning at the time he was writing. So he'll say, Byron alludes to this story in his poem such and such and such, or Shelley alludes to this story in his poem over here. Now, again, having been written in 1855 or so, the Romantic poets are his kind of go-to to show how these this Greek mythology is still relevant. So he's constantly referencing Byron. He's constantly referencing Shelley. Milton pops up a lot. He's constantly referencing Milton. He has these go-to poets which he keeps referencing over and over again. So it's not like it seems to be a very narrow sample of poets that he's drawing from. Now, I was English minor in college. I guess, it was mostly a literature degree, literature minor. So I did actually study some of these Romantic poets a little bit in college and found them a struggle and really haven't come back to them since. A few years ago, I did was listening to an audiobook on the Romantic poets, but haven't really sat and read through them since college. And I'd forgotten what a struggle it was to decode the poetry of the Romantic poets. I mean, I'm sure it's very enlightening and cultured and all this stuff, but it's a struggle to read for the modern reader, for the average person, unless you're in the habit of reading that kind of stuff. Now, Thomas's Bulfinch's prose is very readable. He was reading it in 1855, but it's perfectly readable and quite pleasant, dare I say. So this is quite typical. You have his recounting here, and then he'll say, okay, and here's a poem in which this legend that I've just told you is alluded to. And then, here it is. And then another story. And then here's the poem. And I always found the prose was quite pleasant to read. But then when I got to the poem, I'm like, oh, no. It just... Sorry, I'm complaining about this, but it just completely changed my reading pace. Where I'm going along everything smoothly, and then I get to the poem, and I'm like, I don't understand this poem at all. So then I'm like, okay, well, go back, try it again, reread it, focus. What is this poem saying? I suppose what I should have done is start skipping over the poems. But I've got a certain personality. Some of you, I'm sure on BookTube, will identify with this. If I'm going to read a book, I'm going to read a book. I'm not going to start skipping over parts. It just bugs me. I feel like I haven't read the book or that it's incomplete. So I really did my best to struggle with the Byron and the Shelley and the Milton and all the different poets that Thomas Bulfinch alludes to. Found the poetry that he frequently cites to be hard going. I found his retelling of the myths themselves to be pleasant reading. Now, again, referencing Wikipedia, I was reading on Wikipedia that the bulk of this book is largely a retelling of Ovid's Metamorphosis. I've not actually read Ovid's Metamorphosis yet, although Steve Donahue, once again, I'm influenced by Steve Donahue here. Steve Donahue has praised Ovid's Metamorphosis a number of times on his channel. So one of these days, I've got to get around to reading Metamorphosis. But once I read that in Wikipedia, that this book is largely based off of Ovid's Metamorphosis, I thought, that makes complete sense. First of all of the stories in here, just about all of them, are based on some sort of transformation of sorts. And, there are a lot of transformations in Greek mythology, of course, but it's not all like that. But certainly almost all of the stories in here, the vast majority of stories in here are somebody changing to something else. So Ovid's Metamorphosis, if you're not familiar with it by reputation, is all about something changing into something else. The other thing which kind of clicked the moment I learned from Wikipedia that this was based off of Metamorphosis is the fact that there's no like nowadays Edith Hamilton's Mythology or other books on mythology will try to set these Greek myths up in some sort of chronological fashion. Like, here's the beginning of the universe, here is the age of the Titans, here is the revolt of the gods against the Titans, here's the battle with the giants, here is the creation of man, and just here's down to the age of heroes. And that's in here a little bit. We do get a brief thing about the creation of the world here. But then the chronology afterwards is just all over. And Wikipedia says he's following the chronology of Ovid for the most part. Now, again, I've not read Ovid's Metamorphosis, but I'm familiar with it by reputation, and Steve Donahue has frequently praised it on his channel. One of the things Steve Donahue talks about in one of his videos, and I have no idea which video this is. Steve Donahue does 4 videos a day, so it's very hard to go back and find which video you're looking for. But in one of his videos, a year ago or so, Steve Donahue was talking about how Ovid was very skilled about starting with a frame story and then embedding another story inside the frame story and then embedding another story inside of that, and had these kind of like Russian dolls type approach to storytelling. And yeah, you totally see that here in Bulfinch's Mythology, where a character, there'll be a story about something, and then those characters will tell another story inside of that. So obviously, when I learned he was borrowing this all from Ovid, it makes perfect sense. A lot of stuff here is out of order, but then there also what appears to be. Let me see if I can find it. I marked it in my copy here. He appears to have sometimes borrowed Ovid's Framing without having adjusted it. Yeah. Here it is. So when he gets to his Latona and the Rustic story, he introduces it by saying, some thought the goddess in this instance was more severe than was just, while others praised her conduct as strictly consistent with her virgin dignity. As usual, the recent event brought older ones to mind, and one of the bystanders told this story. So this is how the story of Latona and the Rustics is introduced. Now I'm reading that and I'm like, one of the bystanders? Wait, what bystanders? Like, it was never set up that there are a group of bystanders talking, or that, so I I can only assume that this is borrowed here from Ovid, uh, and was part of the framework that Ovid had used, again with his kind of Russian dolls framing, where there's a group of people standing around telling stories. Uh, but yeah, Bulfinch seems to have rather he he's just borrowed this, but he's not adjusted this to the fact that in his framing, he never set up the fact that there was a group of people talking and bystanders. So, and once I started noticing that, I started noticing a whole bunch of things which seem to contradict earlier stuff being out of order, stuff where he used one version of the story in one part and then another version of the story in another part. For example, I don't want to get into all my nitpicks, but the name of Achilles' son, he changed the name halfway through. And I looked this up on Wikipedia, and apparently Achilles' son has two names, Pyrrhus and Neptolemus. Apologies for mispronouncing the Greek, I'm sure, but he used it once, and then he used the other name again, without clarifying that Achilles' son had two different names. There's a contradiction with Atlas about whether he's holding up the sky or the mountain or who his daughters are. There are all these. Yeah. When he's talking about the story of Ceres, he's got, on one part, Ceres is talking about how this boy is going to teach the men the use of the plow. And then the very next paragraph, Ceres curses the soil and all the plows get broken. But in the previous paragraph, it says Ceres was going to, the boy that Ceres was blessing was going to teach men how to use the plow. Sorry, I'm not doing a good job of explaining this, am I? I guess the point being there are all these contradictions and what seem to be mistakes through this book. And it was interesting. I a couple years ago I reviewed on this channel Tales of Greece and Troy by Andrew Lang. I think that's the right name, which also seemed to have like a lot of inconsistencies and mistakes all the way through it. And Andrew Lang, I didn't appreciate this at the time I made that review, but I've since realized he's a well-respected classicist and fabulist. But I wonder if there was just something about the way books were written in the 19th century. People were writing them out by hand. The word processors were not invented yet. Maybe it was just harder to catch these mistakes, or if you had an inconsistency, you just let it go because you didn't want to write the whole thing out again. I don't know. There is, in addition to the retellings of Ovid, he goes through the Trojan War. Now, I just recently meaning in the past year, so I'm reaching for books off my shelf here, have reread the Iliad and the Odyssey. So that was fresh in my mind. But I still enjoyed Bulfinch's retelling of Homer. And then he retells the Aeneid, the story of Aeneas. Now, the Aeneid is something I read way back in 9th grade. And it's one of those things you think you remember it more or less. But then I was going through and rereading Bulfinch's retelling of that. And I was like, I don't remember this. It made me realize that I don't really remember the Aeneid at all. So I am overdue to reread the Aeneid. If I ever get my hands on a good translation of it. So for my TBR, as the booktubers say, Ovid's Metamorphosis, reread the Aeneid. Then the very end of this book, most of this book is Greek and Roman mythology, but not all. The last 80 pages, so it's 380 pages, maybe, this book. And the last 80 pages are other ancient, the last 80 pages from here are other ancient myths. So there's the Egyptian ones, there's the Norse mythology, there's the Hindu and Buddha stories. There's Wagner's Ring Cycle, which I thought was really interesting. On this channel, I've talked occasionally about Wagner's Ring Cycle and mentioned Wagner's Ring Cycle, if you're not familiar, is this epic 8-hour opera that you see performed, I guess, over 3 or 4 different nights, which is about Vikings and Norse gods and the Valkyries, and it's one of those things where it looks really epic, but there's no way I'm sitting through 8 hours of opera. But I'd be quite interested in a summary of Wagner's opera. And Bulfinch provides that summary. So he has, where is it? He goes through first the epic that it's loosely based on, which is the Nibelungenlied, which is like the epic of I guess it's a later German epic. I guess it has the Norse gods like Thor and Loki, but they're appearing in a different form here because it's not the Vikings anymore. It's the Germans. It's this epic of Siegfried, which is so he retells that, and then he gives Wagner's version and shows how Wagner had taken some of the stuff from this, but also completely made up his own story as well. And so there's a nice little 4-page summary of Wagner's Ring Cycle and how it's the same with the German sources and how it's different. So that was interesting. That largely satisfied my curiosity about what the Ring Cycle was, and I been looking for something like that for years, but finally found it here. By the way, this was not. I mentioned I did this as an audiobook years ago, but the audiobook I had, which was unabridged selections, did not do any of the stuff from the last 80 pages here, where it was the other ancient myths. It was only Greek and Roman stuff. If anyone is familiar with the publishing history of this book, let me know in the comments, because like I've been saying, it's all a little bit confusing to me, but that's my take here on Bulfinch's mythology.